My son added himself to my bank account. He said it was to help. My wife had just had a stroke, and he didn't want me overwhelmed. I later found out he'd told Amber, "Dad can't handle all this right now. He won't even notice." Over the next 4 months, he moved $40,200. Every transfer was under $500. He was right that I wouldn't notice, for about 3 weeks. The bank statement arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 1 month after Ruth's stroke. It was a routine account summary. The kind I had been receiving for 11 years at the same address, on the same light blue paper. I opened it at the kitchen table with my reading glasses and a cup of coffee that was already going cold. I read it twice, then I read it a third time, because the number at the bottom was $22,400 lower than I expected. I sat with that for a long time. I did not panic. I am not by nature a man who panics. I spent 29 years as a structural engineer for the city of Calgary, reviewing load calculations and stress tolerances, and the kind of technical documents where a single misplaced decimal can bring a building down. I know how to read a number. I know when a number is wrong. This number was not wrong. This number was telling me something. I put the statement in the folder I keep in the second drawer of the desk in the spare room. I made a note of the date, the ending balance, and the figure I was expecting. The difference was $22,400. I didn't call anyone that evening. I went to the bank in the morning. If you've ever trusted someone with something that mattered, stay with me. And if you value stories told calmly, without noise, without exaggeration, consider subscribing, because what I found at the bank was only the beginning. My name is Vincent Hale, 68 years old, retired structural engineer, City of Calgary, 29 years, full pension, no debt. House on Elbow Drive, owned outright since 2009. I keep records, tax returns back to 1989, every bank statement filed by year. Ruth calls it a sickness. I call it the habit of a man who spent 3 decades ensuring that numbers were exactly what they appeared to be, because in structural engineering, a decimal in the wrong place brings a building down. Derek is 42. He works in petroleum services procurement. He lives in Airdrie, 40 minutes north. The oil industry has been difficult. The difficult years have been more frequent lately. I say this not to excuse what he did. I say it because it explains why he thought he could. When Ruth collapsed in the kitchen that Thursday morning, I was in the garage. I heard a sound, and found her on the floor beside the stove. Conscious, unable to form words. Derek arrived at the hospital that first evening. He asked the right questions, spoke calmly to the nurses, brought me a sandwich before I'd thought to be hungry. For the first hour I was genuinely glad to have him there. On the second night, he said, "Dad, while Mum's in here, you've got a lot to manage. Bills, prescriptions, insurance. Would it help if I had access to the main account? Just to handle things if you need me to?" I said yes. I was 68 years old with a wife in a hospital bed, and a son offering to carry some weight. What I didn't know. 2 hours later in the hospital parking lot, Derek called Amber. I know this because Amber told the RCMP investigator during her statement. She said Derek told her, "He can't manage all of this right now. He won't be looking at the account. We have a window." Amber said she told him it was wrong. The investigator noted that she spent $4,200 of it on home furnishings 6 weeks later. I said yes to access, not to $40,000. Ruth came home on a Monday. She was tired but functional, sharp-minded but slower on her feet than before. We established a routine morning walks, medication at 9 and 3, physio twice a week. I cooked. She complained about my cooking, which I took as a sign she was recovering. Derek called twice a week. He was attentive. He asked about the physio appointments, about Ruth's sleep, about her appetite. He did not mention the account. I checked the online balance in early April, 3 weeks after Ruth came home. I had a vague expectation of the figure. Pension deposits, utilities, the physio bills, The balance was lower than I expected by what I initially thought was a rounding difference. It was not a rounding difference. Over the following 2 weeks I noticed 3 more transactions I hadn't made. Small ones, $180, $240, $315, each listed as a transfer, with no attached note or payee description in the detail view. I printed the transaction history, sat at the desk in the spare room with a ruler and a highlighter, the same tools I used for 30 years on engineering drawings, and went through every line. I highlighted every transaction I could account for. Pension deposit, hydro bill, physio clinic, grocery load, 3 pharmacy charges for Ruth's prescriptions. Everything else I circled in red. There were 11 red circles. I wrote the amounts in my notebook. I did not confront Derek. I thought, wait, collect the data. Be certain before you speak. I have always believed that precision matters more than urgency. In structural engineering, the worst mistakes are made by people who react before they've finished reading the drawing. A number that looks wrong might be a unit conversion. A gap in a load path might be on a different sheet. You read everything. You verify everything. Then you respond. I applied the same methodology. By the time the April statement arrived and I saw $22,400 gone, I had 8 notebook entries, 7 individually small transfers, and 1 larger one, $14,800, that had left the account on a Saturday afternoon 12 days after Derek received access. The $14,800 one told me everything I needed to know about the smaller ones. My daughter-in-law Amber is 39 years old. She grew up in Red Deer, moved to Calgary for university, met Derek at a mutual friend's barbecue in 2010. She is competent, efficient, and has the particular quality of making uncomfortable things sound administrative when she discusses them. She called me in early April, the week before I went to the bank. She said she was checking in on Ruth. She asked about the physio. She said Derek was glad he'd been able to help with the financials while things were stressful. Nothing major, she said. Just smoothing things out while you had so much on your plate. I said, what do you mean smoothing things out? A pause. Brief. Oh, just some of the bill payments Derek was managing. You know how it is. He didn't want you worrying. Which bills? I asked. The regular ones, she said. Nothing unusual. Just keeping things organized for you. I wrote it down after I hung up. Amber, April 9th. Smoothing things out. Nothing unusual. She hadn't said which bills because there were no bills. There were transfers. I went to the branch on McLeod Trail on a Friday morning, April 18th, and asked to speak with the branch manager. Her name was Carol Price. She'd been at that branch for 6 years and knew my account by sight. I laid out my notebook, my statement, and the printout I'd made of the online transaction history. She reviewed it without speaking. Then she said, Mr. Hale, you added a secondary account holder on March 15th. Under our policy, secondary account holders have full transaction access, unless restrictions are specifically applied. I authorized access, I said. Not full transaction rights. She looked at the form, at my signature, at the adjacent checkbox, which I had not checked, which would have restricted the secondary holder to read-only access. The form was presented to you as a standard joint access edition, she said. Her voice was careful. You signed it without the restriction checkbox selected. I didn't argue. I asked her to pull the complete transaction log for the account from March 15th to present. She printed it. 43 individual transactions. Some small, some significant. Total outflow attributed to the secondary holder's access, $40,200. I sat with the printout for a moment. I'd like to formally request a fraud investigation, I said. Carol Price looked at me, then at the transactions, then back at me. Her junior associate at the adjacent desk had gone very still. To be clear, she said, the secondary account holder is listed as your son. Yes, I said. She picked up the phone. She didn't lower her voice when she said the next part. The junior associate heard every word. I need to escalate a fraud investigation on account ending 4471. The secondary holder is a family member. If you've made it this far, thank you. Stories like this aren't told loudly. They're told carefully. If you're not subscribed yet and you appreciate this kind of storytelling, now is the time. Because what happened next didn't stay inside a bank office. I called Stuart Park the following Monday. Stuart has been my attorney since 2004. He is 60 years old, formerly in corporate law, now in estate and elder financial law, a specialty he moved into, he once told me, because he was tired of helping corporations and wanted to help people. Whether that's entirely true, I can't say, but he has been precise and reliable for 20 years, which is what I require. I sat across his desk and laid out the bank's printout, my notebook and the phone record of Amber's call. Stuart read through everything without saying anything for a long time. Elder financial abuse, he said, when he finished. He's my son. That doesn't change the legal category, Stuart said. In Alberta, unauthorized withdrawal from a joint account where the authorization was obtained under false pretense, in this case a claim of caretaking purpose, constitutes financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. That's not my opinion. That's the Elder Abuse Prevention Act, I said. The bank's fraud team is already reviewing. Good, Stuart said. I'm going to advise you to file with Adult Protective Services concurrently, and I want to send a formal letter of demand before anything else moves. He doesn't know I know, I said. Stuart looked at me. How long do you want to keep it that way? I thought about it. Until I have every document in order, I said. Stuart nodded. Then let's build the case first. I drove home, made dinner, watched Ruth take her evening medication at the kitchen table, methodical, uncomplaining. For 3 nights after that meeting, I sat with the folder closed on the desk and didn't open it. I told myself I was waiting for more documentation. That was partly true. The other part, he was my son. I had taught him to ride a bicycle on this street. I had driven him to his first interview. I had stood in a hospital corridor for 4 hours the night his daughter was born. I almost didn't file. That's the part I don't say easily. On the 4th morning I opened the folder, reviewed the transaction log one more time, and called Stuart. The bank's investigation took 6 weeks. Stuart liaised with the fraud team directly, which kept Derek out of the loop and also kept me from having to speak to him during that period without giving anything away. What the investigation found. The $14,800 transfer, the large one, 12 days after Derek gained access, went to a joint credit card account in Derek and Amber's names. Specifically, it cleared a balance that had been accumulating for 14 months. The card statements which the bank obtained under the Fraud Investigation Authority showed the breakdown: home furnishings, $4,200, a landscaping deposit, $1,800, 11 months of grocery and gas transactions that exceeded Derek's income pattern, and a single charge of $6,100 to a contractor in Airdrie, a basement renovation. The smaller transfers, the $180s and $240s and $315s, went to the same card, ongoing balance management. A slow bleed, designed to stay below the automatic transaction alert threshold the bank applied to its senior account holders. Derek knew that threshold. He had asked me about it during the second night at the hospital. I had told him it was $500, because he'd asked what the bank's fraud alert ceiling was, and I had told him because I was tired, and he was my son, and I didn't think the question was anything other than curiosity. He had used that number as a ceiling for every subsequent withdrawal. Every transfer except the $14,800 was under $500. The $14,800 was a one-time risk he calculated he could take while I was still absorbed in Ruth's recovery. I read Stuart's summary twice, the way I'd read the bank statement twice in April, looking for a detail that changed the picture. A transaction I'd missed, an account for the money that I hadn't considered. There wasn't one. The money had gone into Derek and Amber's daily life, into the house they lived in, the food they ate, the basement where their children played. The renovation had increased the property's value. The landscaping made the yard look better than the neighbors. My $40,000 was in the ground in Airdrie, and it had made their house more beautiful. I thought about this for a long time before I said anything to Stuart. Then I said, "He planned this." "Yes," Stuart said. "He did." "How far back?" Stuart considered. "The card balance goes back 14 months. He would have needed a solution for 14 months. And then Ruth had the stroke." He paused. The stroke was convenient for him. I sat with that sentence for a moment. "Convenient," I said. "I don't mean he wished for it," Stuart said carefully. "I know what you mean," I said. I called my daughter Nina on a Wednesday evening, after I had the full report but before anything had been formally filed. She lives in Halifax. We speak once a week, always on Sunday evenings, always around 8. I called on a Wednesday, which she immediately noticed. "Dad, is Mum okay?" "Mum is fine," I said. "I need to tell you something about Derek." I told her everything. I watched her face on the video call. She was in her kitchen, her husband out of frame, her expression doing the same thing Ruth's face does when she's assessing a situation, still, concentrated, not yet decided. She didn't speak for a moment after I finished. "How much?" she said. $40,200. Another silence. "Dad." Her voice cracked on the word. "How did he—" "I was in the hospital with Mum," I said. "He asked for access to help." I said yes. She was quiet for a long time. "He used the stroke," she said. "Yes," I said. "He used Mum's stroke as the opening." She said it twice, because she needed to hear it twice, before she could hold it as a fact rather than an impossibility. I let her. "What happens now?" she said. "Stuart files Monday," I said. "Adult Protective Services were notified last week. The bank's fraud report goes to the RCMP concurrent with Stuart's filing. And Derek doesn't know." "Not yet." She was quiet again. "Do you want me to come?" she said. "No," I said. "There's nothing to come for yet. When there is, I'll call." "Okay," she said. "Dad." "I know," I said. We didn't say anything else for a moment. Derek called me on a Thursday evening in early July. 3 days after Stuart's filing and 2 days after the RCMP fraud unit received the bank's report. He didn't know about either. He called to ask about Ruth's physio progress. We talked for a few minutes. Normal conversation, the kind we'd had every week for months. He asked if I needed help with anything. I said I was fine. Before he hung up, I said, "Derek, I need to ask you something." "Sure," he said. "The account, the joint access I gave you in March." A pause. Briefer than I expected. He recovered quickly, which told me he'd thought about this conversation before. He'd had a version of it prepared. "What about it?" he said. "I've reviewed the transactions," I said. "All of them. From March 15th through June." Silence. "I don't know what you're seeing," he started. "But some of those transfers were for bills I was covering on your behalf." "Derek," I said. He stopped. "The bank's fraud team has the full transaction log," I said. "Stuart Park has a copy. Adult Protective Services received a notification last week, and the RCMP file opened on Tuesday." The silence after that was different. It wasn't a gathered silence. A man thinking about what to say. It was an empty silence. The silence of a prepared speech suddenly having nowhere to go. "Dad," his voice had changed. "You said I could use it." "I said you could have access," I said. "Not $40,000. It was for the family. We were drowning. You have a pension. You own the house. It was going to come to me eventually anyway. And you don't even spend it," he said. "It just sits there. What are you saving it for?" That sentence. "Derek," he stopped. "Eventually. Anyway is not how money works," I said. "And it's not how families work." Silence. "Mum would understand," he said. "She wouldn't want us struggling." That one landed differently than the others. I let it sit for a moment. "Your mother," I said, "is the reason I didn't contact the RCMP the day I walked out of the bank. Because I spent 3 weeks asking myself what she would want." He didn't say anything. "She would want you to face what you did," I said. "Not be protected from it." A long silence. "I didn't think you'd notice," he said. He said it quietly, not as a defense, more like a confession that surprised even him on the way out. I designed load-bearing structures for 29 years, I said. I notice when something doesn't add up. A pause. Then does Mum know? Not yet, I said. Are you going to tell her? Yes. When? When I'm ready. He didn't say anything. Derek, I said. I want you to understand one more thing. He waited. You called me every week for 4 months. You asked about your mother's physio. You asked about her sleep and her appetite. And the whole time you were moving money out of the account. I opened the week you were born. Silence. I don't want an explanation, I said. I want you to have heard me say that, out loud. So there's no version of this where you misremember it later. I hung up. Amber called me 4 hours later. She said Derek was devastated. She said it had been a moment of panic. The finances had been difficult for longer than I knew. The credit card debt had been weighing on them for over a year, and when I offered Derek access, he had made a decision she didn't support but hadn't been able to stop. That last part was interesting. You couldn't stop him, I said. He was under so much stress, she said. The industry has been brutal. I told him it was wrong. I want you to know that. Did you spend the money? I asked. A pause. Some of it, she said. The landscaping. The furniture. I didn't know the full amount until later. You called me in April, I said. Nothing unusual. Just smoothing things out. She didn't answer. That call was not a check-in, I said. That call was a test. You wanted to know if I'd noticed. She didn't say anything. Amber, I said. The RCMP investigator will be in contact. I suggest you speak to your own attorney before that call. I ended the conversation. The RCMP fraud unit contacted Derek on a Tuesday morning in August. They called his office. His supervisor took the message and flagged it to HR. By Friday, Derek was on administrative leave pending an internal compliance review. His firm had a clause about criminal investigations involving financial fraud. He didn't tell me this. I heard it from Nina, who heard it from a cousin in Airdrie, who worked in the same building. Stuart's filing moved through the system the way these things do. Slowly, with paperwork, with procedural steps that feel anticlimactic compared to the weight of what they're documenting. The RCMP investigation concluded in October. Derek was formally charged under Section 332 of the Criminal Code. Theft by conversion. The charge carries a maximum of 10 years. Stuart says a guilty plea with restitution is likely. We'll know more in the spring. The civil judgment for $40,200 is separate. Asset recovery is in process. What I can tell you is this: Derek and Amber listed their house in Airdrie in August. The basement renovation, the one financed in part with my money, had added to its value. They moved to a rental in Cochrane. I read about the sale in a real estate listing their agent posted publicly. I was not told directly. The $40,200 has not been returned. Stuart has a civil judgment in process. Asset recovery in these cases is slow and often partial. I have been told to expect less than the full amount. I don't speak to Derek. He sent a letter through his own attorney in September. 3 paragraphs that used the word circumstances 4 times and the word sorry. Once, near the end, in a sentence so hedged with qualifications that the apology itself was nearly invisible. Ruth knows. I told her in July, after the RCMP file opened. She sat at the kitchen table and listened without interrupting. Which is unusual for her. She is not by nature a quiet woman. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "He used the stroke." "Yes," I said. She looked at the table. "I carried him for 9 months," she said. "I was in labor for 14 hours. I held him before you did." She didn't say anything else. She picked up her coffee cup, said, "I want to call Nina." That was all. They spoke for an hour. I have not heard Ruth mention Derek since. There is a folder in the second drawer of my desk. It has grown thick over the past 8 months. Bank statements, transaction logs, Stuart's correspondence, the RCMP case number, the civil judgment documents. I will eventually need a second folder. I think about the moment Derek said, "I didn't think you'd notice." I have thought about it more than anything else in this entire sequence of events. Because that sentence tells you everything. Not just what he did, but what he thought of me while he was doing it. What he decided I had become, a man too old, too distracted, too caught up in his sick wife to count his own money. I understand how that happens. I do. A man watches his father grow older, and at some point begins to quietly revise his assessment. The father stops being the man who built things, and becomes the man who needs help. It's a natural shift. It's probably inevitable. What is not inevitable? What is a choice made deliberately, is deciding to take advantage of that revised assessment. That part belongs to Derek alone. Nina called last Sunday from Halifax. She said the boys had drawn pictures for us. Grandma and Grandpa, she said, laughing, their proportions wildly inaccurate. She said she'd mail them. She asked how Ruth was doing. Ruth is doing well, better than last year. She walks every morning. She complains about my cooking with renewed vigor, which I consider a health indicator. She doesn't mention Derek. I don't either. The folder in the second drawer is almost full. He used the stroke. He thought I was finished. He learned I wasn't. If this story resonated with you, there are others like it. Stories about trust, family, and the quiet consequences of underestimating someone. You'll find them in the playlist linked here. Take your time.